Hello, everyone. We're here on Diana Markosian. She's a Russian-born photographer living mostly in the U.S., but I'll give the introductions to herself. She's now part of Magnum Agency that is already spoken on week one. And I wanted to introduce Diana and give her a little bit of time to explain us what she's doing. But I'm fascinated by the way she's looking at her inner self and her own personal history and exploring that visually, and at the same time working in places like Armenia, or one of her homelands, but also Russia, Asia, the US, and we're gonna explore a little bit of that while she's telling us what moves her. Hello, Diana. Thank you very much to be with us, for being with us today. I did a brief introduction of you, but can you explain a little better who's Diana?
So my name pronounced Diana. um, um, and I was born in Russia, and I was raised between Russia and Armenia before my family came to America when I was a kid. And for the last decade, I've been trying to understand myself through photography and understand, um, I think, the world around me through the images I'm making. So I've been photographing since I was 20. I'm now turning 30. And my current project takes place between the former Soviet Union and America, and it looks at how my family came to the United States as immigrants from the former Soviet Union.
But your seminal, or to me, your seminal body of work, it's the one about your father and your relationship with your father.
I think that work was almost an awakening to what my work has become. And I think that work was almost like the beginning of a sentence that I'm writing, or the beginning of a book that I'm writing, and not in the sort of formal way that something needs to be concrete or tangible, but I think it's really this awakening that happened with me and with the work that I'm making, and what I want to say with what it is that I put out into the world.
And in a time where everybody's looking at their self or their own image, because in some of the photographs with you, the one in particular, I remember you sitting on the table with your father. How
Hmm.
how do you navigate through that, showing yourself as a photographer, which on one side there's this theory that we must be invisible, and on the other side you're exploring things that are deeply intimate to you, and it's fascinating the way you were able to do both in putting yourself in the frame, but also being very open about your own anguishes within your own history.
I think I just at a certain point understood that vulnerability and showing weakness wasn't a bad thing, wasn't something that was negative. And I think for me, through this work, the beginning of it, at least the father work, really affected me in a way that I didn't understand how to process for myself. And photography um, was was this, I don't know, strength and weight, and like almost like a backbone. When you feel like you're falling, something keeps lifting you up, and that was what photography was for me. And I really never understood it, and I never understood how real it was until I started to fall. And the thing that has been so constant in my life has been this one thing um, that it's not that I take images every day, but for me, photography is not about the images. It's about this process that um, that I'm experiencing, and from the ideas to actually being in the field and being in the headspace of creating the work to the aftermath when you are left with the work, because that work is it's a legacy that you're creating of not images but of experiences, and it's something that nobody can really take away from you. And that idea of something being taken away is something that I keep experiencing throughout my life, where from childhood to today, it's like things aren't forever, and it's there until it's not. And the one thing that keeps staying is these images and this work that I'm making, and the experiences. So that's what photography has really meant to me. Um, these last 10 years.
But at the same time, you have this almost double curiosity. It's not double, and for your answer, it's obvious that it's all part of you. But you're not only working within your own territory and history and intimacy and your own image sometimes, but also looking at the others, going to Chechnya to look at young girls and forced wedding, going to, going back to the U.S. to California where you were raised and looking at different things happening there. And how do you come along with his ideas? What's your thoughts? What's the way assignment work impacts your own vision? I would like to understand a little bit how do you, and as a young Magnum nominee, you also need to deliver something. How are you coping with that?
I think to me, growth is the number one thing that I'm interested in. Like, am I growing? Am I growing as a person? Am I growing as an artist? I want to feel like I'm evolving. Like, I'm not doing the same work I did a year ago. I'm not doing the same work I did 5 years ago. I keep reinventing the ways I think about images and the ways I understand images for myself. So for me, that pressure of delivering is not something that I necessarily think of. And it's almost like that's the expected. That's the expected. Like, that's not something you question. The question that I have for myself is, how do I do it differently? How do I make this interesting for me? If I'm taking on an assignment, there must be a reason that the client is choosing me and that I'm agreeing to do this assignment. And not everything aligns like that. Like, I think when it doesn't match with your core, I don't do it. And even if it does pay, like, I just don't do it because I know I'm not going to do it well. And if I don't do it well, I'm not going to be hired again. And the last thing that I want to do is disappoint either a client or myself. So for me, like, the most important thing that I can say about personal work is that I have time. Like, I think if I was starting this current project, the Santa Barbara work, I said to myself, okay, it's going to take about 3 months. 2 years later, I'm still working on it, and it's become something so much bigger than what was in my little, vision 2 years ago. And
Can
I
you
think that,
what are you doing in Santa Barbara?
so yeah, just to finish that last thought, but I think time is the biggest difference between personal work and commission work, because when you're commissioned, you're on somebody else's clock, and the clock starts from the day that you're in the field. Whereas when you're doing personal work, if you're not you know making an image one day, you're thinking, okay, I'm connecting. If you're not making an image one day for an assignment, you're failing. You're ultimately, like, at the end of the day, like, you are the images you make. And I don't want to feel so black and white about it, but when you are on assignment, it's much harder to justify why you can't produce. So I think when choosing assignments, it's like you want to feel like, okay, that's me. I'm 100% in, and I can deliver. Like, that's like the then when you can say that confidently, that pressure comes off, because then you're just creating. At least I want to be practical like that, because if you allow the pressure to get in your way, it becomes disabling. So, and to answer this question about what I'm doing here, I've learned about my family story, the other side of it, that of how we arrived to America, and what I learned about it a few years ago. Although I lived with it for 30 years, my mom just recently told me about how we ended up in America, which was inspired by a soap opera we used to all watch in Moscow in our apartment, which was called Santa Barbara. And at that point, the Soviet Union had collapsed. And during the mornings, we'd be, if we were in Armenia, we'd be from the ninth floor to the first floor carrying buckets of water to just have water to wash ourselves in the morning, to wash our clothes. Like, we became poor overnight after the Soviet Union collapsed. And in Moscow, my brother and I were picking bottles, collecting them, trading them for money, waiting in line for bread. And these experiences, and I think our situation, forced my mom to do something different. She made a decision that we were going to move to America. And within 3 days of coming to America, she bought a ticket for all three of us. I didn't know about this. And we boarded a plane, and she said we were going on a trip, on a family holiday. And, um, the next morning, flying 20 hours, the next morning, we arrived in America, in California, and went to the town of Santa Barbara. So 20 years later, I came back to California after being away from America for about 8, 9 years. And I would come to the States, but I specifically did not live here, and came back to America and started working with the original writer of Santa Barbara to create a script, then cast actors to play my family, and started creating images both in California, where we grew up, and in Armenia. So the images take place in both childhood homes, and it's this reconstruction of family history and memory and immigration. And it took me just to cast about a year and a half. So imagine living in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, and every day just going to casting calls. And I saw 263 women for my mother, until eventually going back to Russia, Armenia, and then Georgia, where I eventually found her. So this is the sort of thing about personal work, is you are your own, director, and you don't need to, maybe you need to constantly tell yourself it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, you'll find this person, this will be something special. But at the end of the day, you don't have somebody that you have to report to. And I think that's something that's very liberating, because I think, had I just picked a woman to play my mother, and had I done everything I could have done in 3 months, this project would have been very different than what it is today. I think that would have been more of an idea, and this has become more of my life.
So you're about to turn 30. You went
Hmm.
from the traditional, or let's call it like a traditional photojournalist career of like pursuing news stories, into becoming an author, now becoming a movie director. Uh, who's Diana in 10 years from now? Where do you see yourself? Where is the process?
Um, I would like to have a family in 10 years from now. I would like to be doing something completely different than what I'm doing now. I think for me, growth is not, it's not about career. It's about life, and I would just want to keep evolving. And so, if I can be evolving in different spheres of my photography and also in my personal life, that to me feels successful. Because one thing I don't want to do is be one dimensional in the way I work and just have my career dictate my life, which has been the last 10 years. At a certain point, you just want to kind of pause and just say, okay, what do I want, in my life? What what does growth mean to me, and what sort of work do I want to be making? So I think after this project, after the book, after the installation, it's like you have so much more room to play, because you've just invested 2 years in something that I think feels different, and also gives you credibility in a way that your other work, doesn't necessarily back up your vision. It could back up your vision as a photographer, but does it back up your vision as a director, as a cinematographer, as these other roles? So I think, like, whenever I think about the sort of work I want to be making, I just make it, because I think you make it, and then you will be hired for that sort of work again, and then you don't have to wait for somebody, to.
You basically develop your own voice in order
Hmm.
to others to come and look for your voice. You're not adapting your speech or your vision into what a client wants it to be.
Yeah, and you're constantly experimenting. I think that to me is number one. Is like experimenting and feeling like mistakes are actually gifts, and there's the gray is actually very, very colorful. It's not about making it one thing or the other. It's about just embracing what feels very uncertain. And that to me is the way I want to live my life. So it doesn't feel, it feels open. And when you're open, I think that's when it becomes interesting. Otherwise, it's already been done, and I don't want to fall into that. I'd rather just, completely change gears and do something a little more predictable at that point.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Final question. In a time where everybody has a camera,
Mhm.
everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people are producing images, photography, videos everywhere. Their lunch boxes, their vacations. There's also a visual culture that's being created. 5, 10, 20 years ago, visual culture on people was very different from what it is today. How do you see that? Do you struggle with it? Do you ignore it? Do you embrace it? How do you think of it?
Um, do I struggle with it in what way? Sorry.
In the way that we are being permanently bombarded with images, how do you fit into that bombardment or not? How do you?
Yeah, I definitely struggle with it. I deleted social media, except Instagram, um, which I'm still questioning. But I deleted, I deleted Facebook. I deleted Twitter. I deleted everything that felt like work and like something that felt like it was not really, you know, positive in my life. And I think it's real. Like I don't think somebody's above it. Like I think unless you um, say to yourself, okay, this is where my energy is going to be put. It's not going to be competing with other people. It's going to be put just developing myself. Sorry, we're now competing with California lawnmowers.
That's
um, I think it's super important to be disciplined in in the way you use your time because especially when you're a freelancer, it's like you really need to be focused. And so when you have all of these different mediums, pollution. It feels like pollution. It feels like the air isn't clear, and you just want to feel. I'm seeing palm trees, like leaves, palm tree leaves going past me. You, you just want to feel like things are happening on your terms, and I think through social media there can be these hypes, these fake like. Oh, my life is great. Oh, like I'm published here, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And art isn't about that. Art is about something much more pure and much more intimate, and that's where I want to be with my work. And if that means not engaging with social media or even with people for a day, that's great. Like you just want to feel very connected to the work you're making. I'm
so
sorry.
intelligent.
I'm
No, no,
sorry.
thank
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I wish I could just tell him to stop.
you. No, that's, we'll eventually take off and we'll edit it off.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No worries. No, but that was basically my last question. Like, how do you? Everybody's dealing with these things in a different way. There's some people that are super fan of social media. Others are ignoring it. Others are backing away from it.
Yeah.
But there's also platforms and audiences that are being created by it. In
Yeah.
your case, you're struggling. I'm definitely struggling. One of our next guests is going to be Adriana Zebrauskas, who has 160,000 followers on Instagram, and
Yeah.
so I think everybody's approaching it in a different way. But it's one thing is interesting is youngsters mostly are pretty much not reading newspapers or watching television anymore. They're getting their news from social media.
Mhm.
So it's interesting in terms of like how we, as documentarians, photographers, photojournalists, are interacting with those audiences because
Mhm.
you might not be on social media, but certainly your work in one way or another gets to people. Books is
Mhm.
a good example. We're there's huge. Oh,
Yeah, I think it's how you use a platform. Always, like it's how you engage. It's how you use something. It's not about to me. It's not about deleting accounts. It's not about going off social media. That's just what I've chosen to do. I think it's how you use it, and if somebody benefits from it, that's great. I just don't feel like I need that in my life. Like I just feel very satisfied just being in my own, you know, kind of headspace when I'm making work, especially when I'm making work. Maybe when it's out, you rejoin and you start promoting yourself and you use it again in the way that you need to. I'm not saying that that's what I'm going to do, but I think that that's another solution um, to this issue. Like, I do feel like having distance from social media is really healthy. And actually, whenever I'm in Europe, whenever I'm in Paris, just walking and seeing people without phones, it's one of the most beautiful, beautiful things that I've seen. It's like why we need to exist with a phone in our hand. I have no idea. Like there was a time when you didn't need that, and I kind of want to go back to that.
Wonderful. Diana, Diana, thank you very,
It's like Rihanna with a D.
very, very much.
Of
But
course.
I'm super curious to see what you come up with the book. When is it going to be published?
Next year, 2020, spring.
Spring of 2020. We'll see. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.